Imagine driving your shiny new SUV through peaceful countryside, only to return and find it sunk axle-deep in mud, completely immobilized. That's exactly what happened to dozens of unsuspecting festival-goers who thought Jacob Henderson sprawling. Hayfields in rural Colorado made for convenient free parking. After months of watching strangers damage his livelihood, this fourth-generation farmer had finally had enough of visitors ignoring his no-parking signs. But instead of calling the authorities or installing expensive barriers, Jacob had something else in mind, something that would make these thoughtless visitors think twice about where they left their vehicles. Using nothing but his knowledge of the land and his irrigation system, the question is, what did this resourceful farmer do to solve his parking problem once and for all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Life in the rolling hills of Eagle County, Colorado, had always moved to the gentle rhythm of the seasons for the Henderson family. The crisp mountain air and fertile soil of their 300-acre farm had nurtured generations of crops, from the heirloom wheat varieties that Jacob's great-grandfather first planted in the 1920s to the specialty organic hay that now supplied some of the most prestigious equestrian centers in the American West. From his weathered farmhouse porch, Jacob could see the entire eastern section of the property, where rows of timothy grass swayed in the afternoon breeze, their silver-green blades catching the sunlight. This wasn't just any hayfield. It was the result of decades of careful soil management, selective breeding, and agricultural expertise that had made Henderson hay synonymous with premium quality throughout Colorado and beyond. Jacob had learned the intricacies of hay cultivation from his father Richard, who had inherited that knowledge from his father before him. Each field had its own personality, its own needs and quirks that only became apparent after years of careful observation. The eastern slopes required different irrigation schedules than the western plateau. The north field's soil composition demanded unique fertilizer blends that Jacob mixed himself using formulas passed down through generations. "The hay remembers everything you do to it," his grandfather used to say, his weathered hands running through the grass with the reverence of a musician touching a fine instrument. "Treat it right, and it'll treat you right for generations to come." And the Henderson hay had indeed treated the family well. Their specialty grass blends were sought after by championship horse breeders, organic dairy farms, and even zoological gardens with rare herbivores that required pristine nutrition. This wasn't just grass, it was a premium agricultural product, meticulously cultivated and harvested with precision timing to maximize both nutritional value and yield. The farm itself was a testament to the Henderson family's commitment to both tradition and innovation. The original barn, built by Jacob's great-grandfather from timber harvested on the property, still stood at the heart of the operation, though now it housed state-of-the-art hay-drying equipment alongside antique hand tools that Jacob kept in perfect working condition. The irrigation system, initially installed in the 1960s, had been continually improved and refined to achieve maximum efficiency while preserving the delicate ecosystem of the surrounding watershed. Jacob's grandfather had been one of the first farmers in the region to implement contour plowing, preventing erosion on the sloped sections of their land. His father had pioneered organic farming methods long before they became fashionable, understanding that chemical fertilizers might provide short-term gains, but would damage their soil's complex microbiome in the long run. Each generation had added their wisdom to the family's agricultural knowledge, creating a legacy that Jacob took immense pride in continuing. The Henderson farm wasn't just a business. It was a living history of American agriculture, a tapestry of soil, grass, and human ingenuity woven together over the course of a century. The careful arrangement of windbreaks protected delicate seedlings, while the diverse hedgerows that Jacob's grandmother had planted attracted beneficial insects that naturally controlled pests. Everything worked in harmony, a balanced ecosystem that Jacob maintained with scientific precision and heartfelt devotion. But in recent years, something had begun to disrupt this carefully maintained equilibrium. The Henderson farm sat along what locals called the Mountain View Road, a scenic route connecting Denver to the increasingly popular Hayfield Music and Arts Festival grounds. As the festival grew from a small local gathering to a nationally recognized event, the once quiet country road had transformed into a major thoroughfare during event weekends. At first, the increased traffic had been a minor annoyance, nothing more than distant engine sounds occasionally carrying across the fields. But 3 years ago, something changed. The festival organizers, victims of their own success, had failed to expand their parking facilities to match their growing attendance. During that year's event, the first unexpected vehicle appeared on Jacob's property, a mud-spattered Jeep parked casually at the edge of his east field. Jacob had approached the driver politely when he returned, explaining that this was private property and that even parking on the edge could compact the soil and affect his hay production. The man had been apologetic, moving his vehicle immediately and thanking Jacob for his understanding. It seemed like an isolated incident, easily resolved, but the following year, as the festival's popularity surged again, a handful of cars began appearing on his land during the busiest days. Most drivers responded to Jacob's explanations with respect, though finding alternative parking often proved challenging with the festival's lots filled beyond capacity. Still, the situation remained manageable, a minor inconvenience rather than a serious threat to his livelihood. Everything changed with last year's festival. A popular music magazine had featured Hayfield on its cover, and attendance nearly doubled. The festival's organizers, scrambling to accommodate the unexpected crowds, had hastily arranged some overflow parking in neighboring fields, but it proved woefully inadequate for the surge of visitors. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What began as a trickle quickly became a flood as word spread through social media about free parking on the empty fields near the festival grounds. Jacob watched in disbelief as a steady stream of vehicles, from mud-splattered pickup trucks to luxury SUVs, turned off Mountain View Road and drove directly onto his hayfields, ignoring the private property and no trespassing signs he had installed the previous season. By midday, nearly 30 vehicles were scattered across his eastern fields, their tires crushing the carefully cultivated timothy grass that would have been harvested the following week. Some drivers had even moved his temporary barriers aside to access prime spots closer to the festival entrance. When Jacob approached a group emerging from a shiny Range Rover, their response left him speechless. "It's just grass, man," said a young man in expensive festival attire, waving dismissively at the crushed hay. "It'll grow back. We paid a fortune for these tickets. Where are we supposed to park?" His companions nodded in agreement, seemingly baffled by Jacob's concern over what they perceived as meaningless vegetation. They couldn't see, or chose not to see, that they were parking on Jacob's livelihood, on crops that represented not just income, but the continuation of a century-long agricultural tradition. The impact on his hayfields became increasingly visible as the festival weekend progressed. The carefully managed soil, developed over generations to provide the perfect growing medium, became compacted under the weight of vehicles. Oil drips from poorly maintained cars left stains that would persist in the soil for seasons to come. Drunk festival-goers returning to their vehicles trampled additional areas, expanding the damage beyond just tire tracks. Jacob tried everything he could think of to address the situation diplomatically. He installed additional signage, including detailed explanations about the hayfield's importance and the damage caused by vehicles. He approached the festival organizers, who expressed sympathy but offered little concrete assistance beyond a half-hearted social media post asking attendees to respect local farmers. He even stationed his teenage nephews at the farm's entrance during peak hours, trying to direct drivers away from his fields, but they were overwhelmed by the volume of vehicles and often simply ignored. The final insult came when Jacob discovered a group having an impromptu tailgate party in the middle of his prized Timothy field, the one reserved for his highest-paying equestrian clients. They had set up folding chairs and coolers, their trucks, speakers blasting music while they trampled a circular area of premium hay. When he explained that they were damaging specialized crops, one woman laughed and offered him a beer, as if that would compensate for the destruction of crops representing thousands of dollars in potential income. That evening, as Jacob surveyed the damage to his fields, calculating the significant losses he would face in both immediate harvest and long-term soil health, something shifted inside him. The frustration that had been building for months crystallized into determination. He remembered something his grandfather used to say when faced with seemingly insurmountable problems. Nature always provides the answer if you're patient enough to look for it. Standing in the middle of his damaged fields, as the festival's distant lights illuminated the night sky, Jacob began to formulate a plan. He wouldn't need confrontation or expensive solutions. The answer was already there, integrated into the very infrastructure of his farm. His gaze drifted to the irrigation control station at the field's edge, and slowly a smile spread across his weathered face. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Jacob had worked out every detail of his strategy. After all, no one understood the land's natural characteristics, its drainage patterns, soil composition, and water retention properties, better than the man whose family had farmed it for generations. The eastern hayfields that had become impromptu parking lots sat on a subtle depression in the landscape, a feature most visitors wouldn't notice, but which played a crucial role in the farm's natural water flow. The irrigation system his father had installed in the 1980s had been designed with precision, allowing for targeted water delivery to different sections of the property. With some minor adjustments, Jacob could isolate the eastern fields and control exactly how much moisture reached the soil, and more importantly, when. He spent the day making careful preparations, adjusting valves and checking the weather forecast. A light rain was predicted for early morning. Perfect conditions to complement what he had in mind. Mother Nature, it seemed, approved of his plan. The last day of the festival promised to be the busiest yet. The headline acts would be performing, drawing the largest crowds of the weekend. Jacob watched from his porch as the first vehicles began arriving at dawn, drivers eager to secure prime parking spots regardless of property lines or posted signs. By mid-morning, his eastern hayfields had once again transformed into unauthorized parking lots, vehicles of all descriptions scattered across the Timothy grass. Jacob noted with particular interest that the most expensive cars, luxury SUVs, sports cars, and even a few high-end European sedans, had claimed the central area of his eastern field, the section with the most valuable specialty hay varieties. And also, not coincidentally, the lowest point in the landscape's subtle depression. Jacob waited patiently as the last stragglers parked and headed toward the festival grounds. Then, with the timing that comes from decades of agricultural experience, he made his way to the irrigation control station. The morning rain had already softened the ground slightly, not enough for casual observers to notice, but providing the perfect foundation for what would follow. With methodical precision, Jacob began implementing his plan. He started with a subtle adjustment to the underground irrigation feeds that served the eastern fields. The change was almost imperceptible at first, just enough water to begin saturating the deeper soil layers without creating visible surface moisture. He monitored the flow carefully, making minor adjustments based on his intimate knowledge of how water moved through the various soil types on his property. This wasn't about causing damage or creating hazards. It was about teaching a lesson in respect. Over the next few hours, he gradually increased the water flow to specific zones, carefully controlling the soil saturation levels. The irrigation system his father had designed worked perfectly, allowing him to create precise areas of softened soil beneath the parked cars while keeping the surface appearing relatively normal. By mid-afternoon, the soil beneath the vehicles had transformed from solid ground into something far less stable, though from above little had changed. The water had been delivered so gradually and deeply that it didn't pool on the surface. Instead, it had turned the subsoil into a soft, yielding bed that would make departure interesting for those who had so casually dismissed the importance of his hayfields. Jacob took a walk through the makeshift parking area, observing his handiwork with quiet satisfaction. To any casual observer, nothing would appear amiss. The ground still looked relatively solid, with only slight hints of the moisture content below. But Jacob knew what awaited the returning festival-goers. His grandfather would have appreciated the elegant simplicity of the solution, working with the land's natural properties rather than against them. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob returned to his normal farm duties, occasionally checking the soil moisture sensors he had installed throughout the affected areas. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The ground remained firm enough to walk on, but had lost the structural integrity needed to support the weight of vehicles, particularly in the lower-lying areas where the most expensive cars were parked. From his barn, he could hear the music from the festival's final performances, the distant sounds of celebration oblivious to the lesson in agricultural respect that was quietly developing. As the sun began its descent toward the Rocky Mountain horizon, casting long shadows across his fields, Jacob prepared himself for the evening's entertainment, though not the kind the festival organizers had planned. The first sign that his strategy was working came around 8:30 p.m., as the earliest festival-goers began returning to their vehicles. A silver BMW sedan attempted to back out of its spot, only to find its rear wheels spinning ineffectively against the now soft ground. The driver's confused expression was visible even from Jacob's vantage point on his porch. The man got out, his designer sneakers immediately sinking into the moistened soil, and circled his vehicle with growing alarm. Within the next hour, as the main acts concluded and more visitors returned to their vehicles, the true magnitude of Jacob's irrigation innovation became apparent. One by one, drivers discovered that their cars had become inadvertent participants in an impromptu soil consistency experiment. Wheels spun, digging themselves deeper into the soft earth. Luxury vehicles with low ground clearance found themselves particularly challenged, their undercarriages gradually settling onto the increasingly muddy surface. Jacob watched it all unfold, maintaining his position on the porch, a glass of his favorite local bourbon in hand. He hadn't damaged any vehicles or broken any laws. He'd simply watered his fields as any responsible farmer would. The fact that he'd chosen to water these particular sections on this particular day was, of course, purely coincidental. The scene that unfolded over the next few hours could only be described as chaotic revelation. As more festival-goers returned to their vehicles, the realization of their predicament spread through the crowd. The carefully curated festival appearances quickly deteriorated as attendees attempted to navigate the now treacherous ground in their fashionable footwear. A white Tesla, whose owner had earlier dismissed Jacob's warnings with a wave of his hand, now sat helplessly with its wheels spinning futilely in the moistened soil. Each attempt to accelerate only dug the electric car deeper. The owner's face had turned nearly as red as the setting sun as he paced around it, making angry phone calls and gesturing wildly at the ground beneath his feet. Nearby, a group of friends who had earlier held the impromptu tailgate party in Jacob's premium Timothy section found themselves in an equally challenging situation. Their pickup truck, positioned for what they had called festival vibes, now leaned slightly to one side as the soft soil beneath it continued to yield to its weight. Their attempts to push it free were proving both muddy and fruitless. The reactions varied from confusion to outrage. Some immediately started pointing fingers, demanding to know what had happened to the ground that had seemed perfectly firm hours earlier. Others tried increasingly desperate solutions, placing festival blankets under wheels for traction, attempting to dig pathways with plastic cups, or calling for tow trucks that would have difficulty reaching the stranded vehicles without risking getting stuck themselves. A particularly vocal woman in designer festival wear marched up to Jacob's porch, her once pristine boots now caked with mud. "This is completely unacceptable," she declared, waving her phone at him. "I have a flight to catch tomorrow morning." Jacob calmly took a sip of his bourbon before responding. "Ma'am, I'm simply maintaining my farm's irrigation schedule. The hay requires very specific moisture levels for optimal growth, especially after being compacted by unauthorized vehicles." The arrival of local law enforcement added another layer to the unfolding drama. 2 Eagle County Sheriff's deputies responded to multiple calls about suspicious ground conditions at the Henderson farm. Jacob calmly showed them his irrigation maintenance logs and explained his regular soil management practices. The deputies, both from farming families themselves, could barely suppress their knowing smiles as they informed the stranded drivers that no laws had been broken. After all, a farmer has every right to water his crops. As the evening wore on, the situation began to take on an almost festive atmosphere, though decidedly different from the music festival that had preceded it. Stranded visitors, realizing they weren't going anywhere quickly, began sharing their predicaments on social media. "Stuck at Henderson's" started trending locally, with photos and videos of luxury vehicles stranded in the mud spreading rapidly across various platforms. Some of the more pragmatic visitors eventually surrendered to the absurdity of the situation. A group of tech professionals, their cars thoroughly mired in the soft soil, set up an impromptu post-festival gathering using their remaining supplies. They were overheard discussing the ingenious passive-aggressive irrigation strategy, though their appreciation might have been influenced by their dwindling festival refreshments. The festival organizers finally made an appearance as the situation escalated. Melissa Chen, the event director, arrived in an all-terrain vehicle to assess the predicament. Her conversation with Jacob was brief but significant. Chen, who had built the festival from a small local event into a major attraction, couldn't help but acknowledge the elegant simplicity of Jacob's approach. "You know," she said, looking out over the field of stranded vehicles, "we spent a fortune on festival security and crowd management, and none of our consultants came up with anything this effective." As darkness fell completely, Jacob began implementing the second phase of his plan. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that he couldn't leave people stranded indefinitely. Using his tractor and some carefully placed wooden planks, he began helping extract vehicles one by one. The process was slow and methodical, giving each driver plenty of time to reflect on their parking choices while they waited their turn. The extraction process revealed another layer of his carefully planned strategy. The only way to reach many of the stranded vehicles was by laying temporary paths through his hayfields, paths that required drivers to fully appreciate the complexity and value of his agricultural operation. As they waited, Jacob would casually explain the different hay varieties, the importance of soil management, and the years of careful cultivation that went into producing premium hay for specialized markets. Many of the drivers, their earlier arrogance softened by hours of waiting and the humbling experience of being stuck, began to show genuine interest in his explanations. A marketing executive waiting for his BMW to be freed actually took notes on his phone as Jacob explained how soil compaction from unauthorized parking could damage the root systems of perennial grasses, affecting yields for multiple seasons. The last car wasn't extracted until well past midnight. By then, most of the drivers had gained a new appreciation for the complexity of modern agriculture and the importance of respecting farmland. Some even apologized to Jacob, acknowledging that they had never considered the impact their parking could have on his livelihood. As the final vehicle departed, leaving deep ruts in the soil that would need attention in the morning, Jacob stood in his hayfield under the stars. The night air was filled with the familiar scent of grass and moistened earth. His grandfather had always said that farming was as much about teaching as it was about growing. This particular day had certainly proved that point. News of the Great Festival Parking Incident, as local media dubbed it, spread through Colorado's agricultural communities like wildfire. By sunrise the next morning, Jacob's farm had become the talk of Eagle County, though not in the way anyone might have expected. The videos and photos shared by the stranded festival-goers had gone viral, spawning countless comments and social media discussions about respect for agricultural land and responsible event attendance. Local news crews arrived early, hoping to interview the farmer who had found such an innovative solution to unauthorized parking. Jacob, still in his work clothes and preparing for his morning field inspection, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Rather than shy away from the attention, he saw an opportunity to educate the public about something bigger than parking disputes. "This isn't just about cars in a hayfield," he explained to a reporter from the Denver Post as they walked along, the rows of timothy grass still bearing tire tracks from the previous day. "It's about understanding and respecting agricultural heritage. These fields represent years of careful cultivation, and each one contributes to the livelihood of not just my family, but the entire agricultural supply chain. When people treat farmland like a convenience, they're not just disrespecting property, they're threatening a way of life that feeds communities." The story resonated far beyond the usual farming circles. Environmental groups praised Jacob's non-violent approach to protecting agricultural land. Sustainable farming advocates used the incident to highlight the challenges faced by traditional farmers in tourist-heavy regions. Even some of the previously stranded visitors began posting thoughtful reflections about their experience, with one influential music blogger writing a viral post about learning humility from a farmer's ingenious problem-solving. Melissa Chen, the director of the Hayfield Festival, proved surprisingly supportive in the aftermath. The morning after the incident, she arrived at Jacob's property with her entire management team, ready to make amends. "We've been handling this all wrong," she admitted as they surveyed the damaged hayfields together. "We've been so focused on creating experiences for our attendees that we forgot about respecting the very thing that makes this region special, the land itself and the people who tend it." What followed was an unexpected collaboration between the fourth generation farmer and the modern festival organizer. Chen proposed a solution that would benefit both parties. Hayfield would construct a state-of-the-art parking facility on their own property, complete with sustainable design features to minimize environmental impact. More importantly, they would incorporate an educational component into their festival experience, teaching attendees about the region's agricultural heritage and the importance of preserving traditional farming practices. Jacob found himself working alongside Chen's team to design informational materials that would be distributed to all Hayfield attendees. These materials explained the delicate balance of agricultural ecosystems, the importance of soil health, and the generations of knowledge that went into producing high-quality crops. His father's irrigation system, ironically, became a featured case study in sustainable farming practices. The incident sparked a broader conversation throughout Eagle County about the balance between tourism and agriculture. Other event venues began implementing similar educational programs, and the Regional Tourism Board developed new guidelines for responsible event attendance. Signs appeared throughout the area, reminding visitors that they were entering working agricultural areas, not public recreation spaces. Local government officials, seeing an opportunity to address a growing problem, worked with farmers and event organizers to develop better transportation infrastructure throughout the county. They created designated shuttle services to popular destinations, ensuring that agricultural land would be protected while still accommodating the region's vital tourism industry. Jacob's irrigation system gained unexpected fame in farming circles. Agricultural communities from neighboring states sent representatives to study his water management techniques, though he always downplayed the system's more creative applications. "My father designed this for growing hay," he would say with a slight smile. "Anything else it might do is purely coincidental." The following spring, as new growth appeared in his fields, Jacob noticed another change in his corner of Eagle County. Visitors to the area, having learned about the importance of agricultural preservation, would often slow down when passing his farm, pointing out features they had come to appreciate. The careful arrangement of the fields, the subtle signs of the irrigation system at work, the rich diversity of grasses that made Henderson Hay special. Melissa Chen's parking facility proved to be a success, its design winning environmental awards for minimizing runoff and incorporating native landscaping. The educational center became a mandatory first stop for festival attendees, complete with interactive displays featuring the history of Colorado agriculture. Jacob's father's original irrigation plans held a place of honor, though the display tactfully avoided mentioning their role in the famous parking incident. 1 year after the incident, Jacob hosted a special event of his own, the first ever Eagle County Agricultural Heritage Day. Farmers from throughout the region came together to share their knowledge with the public, teaching visitors about the intricate relationship between land, climate, and cultivation that made the county's agricultural products unique. The parking arrangements, needless to say, were meticulously organized, with shuttle buses bringing visitors from designated lots miles away. As he walked through his eastern hayfield that evening, Jacob stopped at the spot where a year earlier dozens of luxury cars had found themselves stranded in his carefully moistened soil. The ground had fully recovered, the timothy grass growing more vibrantly than ever, perhaps benefiting from the unintended aeration provided by the extraction efforts. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze. Sometimes the land itself teaches the best lessons. The incident had changed more than just parking habits in Eagle County. It had reminded people that beneath the surface of rural America lay generations of agricultural wisdom and hard work. Jacob's creative solution had not only solved his immediate problem, but had helped bridge the gap between the county's agricultural heritage and its tourism-focused future, ensuring that both could thrive together in carefully cultivated harmony. 5 years after the infamous Great Festival parking incident, the transformation of Eagle County's approach to agricultural tourism was evident to anyone who visited the region. What had started as one farmer's creative solution to a parking problem had evolved into a movement that redefined the relationship between agriculture and tourism throughout Colorado's mountain communities. Jacob's farm had become something of a legend in farming circles, though not entirely for the reasons one might expect. Agricultural students from as far away as California and Iowa would visit Henderson Hay to study his father's innovative irrigation system, officially for its efficient water management capabilities, though the knowing smiles exchanged during these tours suggested the system's other creative applications hadn't been forgotten. The incident had sparked what locals now called the Eagle County Renaissance. Tourism hadn't decreased. In fact, it had grown, but its nature had fundamentally changed. Visitors to the county now came not just for music festivals and mountain scenery, but for what was termed agricultural immersion experiences. Highfield Festival's educational center had expanded 3 times to accommodate growing interest, and their waiting list for pre-festival farm tours often stretched months in advance. Melissa Chen's parking facility had become a model for sustainable event infrastructure throughout Colorado's mountain communities. The underground structure, with its green roof, planted with native grasses, had won multiple architectural and environmental awards. More importantly, it had proved that modern tourism facilities could coexist with traditional agricultural landscapes without compromising either. But perhaps the most significant change was in the visitors themselves. The entitled attitude that had once characterized festival tourism had been replaced by something more respectful, more curious. Tour groups would often spend as much time learning about soil composition and irrigation techniques as they did enjoying musical performances. Social media influencers who once posed carelessly among crops now created content about sustainable farming practices and agricultural preservation. Jacob himself had become an unlikely ambassador for this new approach to rural tourism, though he still preferred working among his hayfields to public speaking. He occasionally gave talks at agricultural conferences about the importance of maintaining boundaries between tourism and farming. His story had even made its way into several business school case studies about creative problem-solving and sustainable tourism management. Henderson Hay itself had evolved while staying true to its roots. Jacob had worked with local educational institutions to develop an apprenticeship program, teaching young farmers the traditional techniques that had sustained the region for generations. The program became so popular that other farms throughout the county began adopting similar initiatives, creating a new generation of farmers who understood both traditional methods and modern sustainability practices. One morning, as Jacob walked through his eastern hayfield with a group of agricultural students, he stopped at a particular section of timothy grass. "These," he explained, "are some of our oldest perennial stands. They've survived drought, early frosts, and yes, even a brief career as a parking lot." The students laughed, but their notes became more detailed as he explained how the soil had recovered from the compaction caused by unauthorized parking and how certain sections had actually shown improved growth patterns after the incident, a testament to the resilience of both the land and the agricultural practices that honored it. The incident had also sparked an unexpected trend in the agricultural industry itself. Several specialty hay producers began marketing limited edition Respect the Land bales, with proceeds supporting agricultural preservation initiatives. The packaging featured artistic renderings of various farming techniques, though none quite dared to depict luxury cars stranded in carefully irrigated soil. Local government officials from other tourist-heavy agricultural regions frequently visited Eagle County to study what they called the Henderson model of tourism management. The balance between accessibility and preservation that had emerged in the wake of the parking incident had become a template for other communities facing similar challenges. Even the technology industry had taken notice. Several Denver startups had developed apps inspired by the incident, helping tourists find appropriate parking while learning about agricultural preservation. Jacob's father's irrigation system had been designated a Colorado Agricultural Heritage Innovation, complete with a small plaque that diplomatically described it as a versatile water management system that demonstrated unexpected applications in tourism management. The plaque had become a popular spot for visitors to take photos, though Jacob noticed they were always careful to stay on the designated paths. The incident had even made its way into popular culture. A well-known country music artist had recorded a song called "Stuck in the Farmer's Field," which became an unexpected hit. Though its lyrics were humorous, the chorus carried a deeper message about respecting rural traditions. The songwriter, who'd been one of the stranded festival-goers, had apparently found both inspiration and humility in the experience. As Jacob stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, he reflected on how a simple solution to a parking problem had catalyzed such far-reaching changes. The county still drew crowds of tourists, but now they came with a different purpose, not just to take from the land, but to understand and respect the complex agricultural traditions that made it special. A tour group was visible in the distance, listening intently as a guide explained the importance of proper soil management in hay production. Their vehicles were neatly parked in a designated area, and they stayed carefully within the marked paths as they learned about the county's agricultural heritage. Jacob smiled, raising his glass of bourbon in a quiet toast to his father's and grandfather's memory. The old men had always said that the land would teach its own lessons. Sometimes it just needed a little help with the curriculum. 10 years had passed since the parking incident, and Jacob found himself preparing for a very special event at Henderson Hay. Colorado State University had chosen his farm as the site for their annual Agricultural Innovation Summit, bringing together farmers, researchers, and industry leaders from around the world. The irony wasn't lost on Jacob. His father's irrigation system, originally designed for simple hay cultivation, had become a case study in creative problem-solving and was now drawing international attention. The morning of the summit dawned, clear and crisp, typical of Colorado in early autumn. Jacob stood in his father's old office, now transformed into a small museum of agricultural history. The room's walls were lined with photographs documenting the farm's evolution, including a few carefully curated images from what the media had dubbed the Great Parking Incident of '23. His father's original irrigation plans held a place of honor, their yellowed pages protected behind museum-grade glass. As Jacob adjusted his bolo tie, a rare concession to the formality of the occasion, he caught his reflection in the window. The past decade had added some silver to his hair, but his eyes still held the same determined glint that had sparked his creative solution to the parking problem all those years ago. Outside, he could see teams of university students setting up displays and information stations throughout the farm, each carefully positioned along the specially designed educational paths that now wound between the fields of Timothy grass. The summit's theme this year was agricultural innovation in the face of modern challenges, and Jacob had been asked to deliver the keynote address. As he reviewed his notes, he couldn't help but smile at how his father's simple irrigation system had become a symbol for the creative preservation of agricultural traditions in an increasingly tourism-driven world. The farm itself had evolved in ways Jacob could never have predicted. The areas once used as impromptu parking lots had been transformed into demonstration gardens, showing visitors the complexity of hay cultivation and soil management. Each section told a story, from the importance of proper drainage to the role of soil microbes in maintaining healthy grass stands. Even the infamous parking incident had its own educational station, though the description tactfully focused on creative solutions to modern agricultural challenges. The morning's first presentation would take place in what had once been the most popular unauthorized parking area. Now it featured an outdoor classroom complete with sustainable seating made from reclaimed barnwood. As Jacob walked past, he noticed a group of international students already gathered, eagerly discussing soil composition and water management techniques in various languages. Melissa Chen, now a close friend and collaborator, arrived early for the summit. The festival director had undergone her own transformation over the years, trading her event management focus for more sustainable tourism initiatives. Her Hayfield Festival had become a model for responsible event planning, and their joint educational programs had helped reshape the county's approach to agricultural preservation. "Remember when all we worried about was where people parked?" Chen joked as they walked through the eastern hayfield together. "Now we're teaching the world about sustainable agriculture." The two had become unlikely partners in what many considered a revolution in agricultural tourism. Their collaborative approach had shown that traditional farming practices and modern tourism could coexist with the right boundaries and mutual respect. The summit's attendees began arriving precisely at the designated time, their vehicles neatly arranged in Hayfield's award-winning parking facility, with shuttle buses transporting them to Henderson Hay. Among them were agricultural experts from traditional farming regions across America and beyond, eager to learn how Eagle County had managed to preserve its agricultural heritage while accommodating millions of annual visitors. The parking incident had become something of a legend in international farming circles, though Jacob noticed the European visitors seemed particularly amused by the very American solution to the problem. As Jacob prepared to take the stage for his keynote address, he glanced at the old irrigation control panel, now mounted as a historical display. The system itself had been modernized over the years, but they had preserved this piece as a reminder of how innovation often comes from unexpected places. Next to it, a small plaque quoted his grandfather, "The land always knows what it needs. Sometimes it just needs help teaching others to listen." The audience that gathered for his speech represented a cross-section of the agricultural world. Fourth-generation farmers sitting next to tech entrepreneurs, hay producers alongside climate scientists, tourism experts mixed with soil conservation specialists. All of them were there to learn about what had become known as the Henderson approach to agricultural preservation in the modern era. Jacob began his speech with a simple question. What do you do when the world starts treating your farmland like a parking lot? The audience chuckled, familiar with the story that had brought them there. But as he continued, he moved beyond the humorous aspects of the incident to address the deeper issues it had revealed. The challenge of preserving agricultural traditions in an increasingly tourism-driven economy, the importance of creative problem-solving in modern farming, and the need for mutual respect between visitors and agricultural communities. Behind him, through the large windows of the conference center, his hayfields stretched out in neat rows, the morning sun glinting off the modern irrigation system that had evolved from his father's original design. The timothy grass itself seemed to stand a little straighter, as if aware it was now part of a larger story about preservation, innovation, and the unexpected ways that positive change can grow from challenging situations. As Jacob concluded his keynote speech at the Agricultural Innovation Summit, an unexpected visitor made her way through the crowd. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, head of Sustainable Agriculture at Colorado State University, carried something that immediately caught Jacob's attention. A worn leather notebook that he recognized from his father's old toolbox. She had discovered it in the university's archives, where it had been misplaced decades ago. The notebook contained his father's original thoughts on farm irrigation, including detailed observations about soil composition and water flow that had never been implemented. As Jacob carefully turned the age-worn pages, he found himself looking at hand-drawn diagrams that seemed remarkably ahead of their time. His father had envisioned a system that could respond automatically to soil moisture levels, something that modern farms were only now beginning to implement with sophisticated sensors and computer controls. Your father was thinking about precision. Agriculture before we even had a name for it, Dr. Rodriguez explained, pointing to notations in the margins. And that incident with the parking, it proved something he wrote right here. She turned to a dog-eared page where his father had scrawled, "The secret isn't just knowing how water moves through soil, but understanding how the soil itself can become an active participant in farm management." The discovery of the notebook sparked a new phase in Henderson Hay's evolution. Working with Dr. Rodriguez and a team of graduate students, Jacob began implementing his father's unrealized innovations. They integrated modern technology with the original concepts, creating what they called a heritage-forward approach to agricultural management. The first test area was, fittingly enough, the section of hayfield that had once served as impromptu festival parking. They installed sensors that could detect not just soil moisture, but also compaction, chemical composition, and microbial activity. The irrigation system was upgraded to respond automatically to these measurements, creating a dynamic relationship between water management and soil health that his father had only dreamed of. The project attracted attention from agricultural technology companies around the world. Several offered to fund further research, seeing the potential for applications beyond hay production. Jacob carefully selected partners who understood the importance of maintaining the balance between innovation and tradition that had become Henderson Hay's hallmark. Melissa Chen proved particularly valuable during this phase, offering her event management expertise while respecting the agricultural wisdom that underpinned everything. "You know," she remarked one day as they reviewed data from the new sensor network, "your father's parking solution was really the first example of responsive soil management in action. He just used different kinds of sensors, namely entitled tourists in luxury cars." The integration of his father's theories with modern technology led to unexpected discoveries. They found that the soil in areas once compacted by parked cars had developed unique characteristics that actually improved certain aspects of hay production. The pressure had created deeper channels for root systems, allowing grasses to access minerals they wouldn't have reached otherwise. It was a perfect example of what Jacob's grandfather had always said about every challenge containing an opportunity. As news of these developments spread, Henderson Hay began hosting a new kind of visitor. In addition to agricultural students and festival attendees, tech entrepreneurs and environmental scientists came to study what they called the Henderson method, the integration of traditional farming wisdom with cutting-edge technology. The parking incident, once a source of local amusement, was now taught as a case study in agricultural innovation courses. The farm's educational programs expanded to include workshops on soil science and water management. Participants would often start by hearing the parking story, but they stayed to learn about the complex interactions between soil, water, and grass cultivation that had made it possible. The irrigation system that had once stranded luxury cars was now helping to train the next generation of sustainable farmers. Jacob found himself increasingly pulled into conversations about the future of agriculture. At conferences and seminars, he was asked to speak not just about the parking incident, but about the broader implications of combining traditional knowledge with modern innovation. He always made sure to credit his father's influence, often quoting from the recently discovered notebook. The notebook itself became something of a sensation in agricultural circles. University presses wanted to publish it, tech companies wanted to digitize it, and museums wanted to display it. Jacob chose instead to make it the centerpiece of a new research center on the farm, where his father's ideas could continue to influence future innovations in sustainable agriculture. One particularly meaningful project emerged from this period: the development of a soil rehabilitation program for farmland damaged by excessive tourism. Using the lessons learned from the parking incident and the subsequent soil recovery, they created protocols for restoring compacted soil and rebuilding healthy microbial communities. The program was soon in demand throughout tourist-heavy agricultural regions worldwide. Dr. Rodriguez and her team made another fascinating discovery during their research. The soil samples from the areas once used for parking showed unique bacterial communities that had evolved to break down trace amounts of automotive fluids. These specialized microbes were now contributing to the farm's overall soil health in unexpected ways. "Your father's irrigation solution didn't just teach people a lesson," she told Jacob. "It actually created a more resilient ecosystem." This discovery led to a new line of research into what they termed adaptive agricultural systems, farming practices that could turn environmental challenges into advantages. The parking incident, viewed through this lens, became a perfect example of how agricultural systems could respond to and even benefit from human interference if managed correctly. As Jacob walked through his eastern hayfield one evening after a long day of research meetings, he found himself at the spot where that first BMW had become stuck in the irrigated soil all those years ago. Now it was home to some of his healthiest timothy grass, producing hay with a complexity that even his father might not have predicted. He pulled out the old notebook, its pages now carefully preserved in archival sleeves, and read one of his favorite passages. "In the end, the land always has more to teach us than we have to teach it." 20 years had passed since that fateful day when Jacob Henderson had used his father's irrigation system to teach some over-eager festival-goers a lesson about respecting agricultural land. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, much like that one, he stood in his hayfield, watching his own daughter Maya adjust the settings on their state-of-the-art soil management system. Maya, named after her great-grandmother, had grown up hearing the story of the great parking incident as bedtime entertainment. Now, at 25, she represented the next generation of agricultural innovation at Henderson Hay. With degrees in both agronomy and environmental engineering, she embodied the perfect blend of traditional farming wisdom and modern technological expertise that had become the farm's hallmark. Henderson Hay itself had evolved into something that even Jacob sometimes found hard to believe. What had started as a simple family farm was now the Henderson Center for Agricultural Innovation and Sustainability, though locals still affectionately called it the parking teacher. The center had become a global hub for research into sustainable farming practices, drawing scientists, farmers, and students from around the world. The original irrigation system that had starred in the parking incident was now preserved in its own dedicated museum space, complete with interactive displays showing how it had worked. Next to it, a state-of-the-art simulation allowed visitors to experience what it felt like to have their vehicle gradually sink into precisely moistened soil. It had become one of the most popular exhibits, especially among younger visitors who could hardly believe there was a time when people would casually park on active farmland. Melissa Chen, now in her 70s, but still sharp as ever, had remained a steadfast partner in the farm's evolution. Her festival management fortune had helped fund many of the center's research initiatives, though she always insisted that the real value came from Jacob's agricultural expertise. Their unlikely friendship had become legendary in the county, often cited as an example of how traditional farming and modern event management could work together for mutual benefit. The parking facility Chen had built had itself become a case study in sustainable architecture. Its design had been replicated throughout event venues worldwide, and the original structure had been upgraded with solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations. The educational center had expanded into a full-scale agricultural academy where traditional farming techniques were taught alongside the latest technological innovations. On this particular morning, the farm was preparing for a very special event, the inaugural World Congress on Agricultural Preservation and Innovation. Delegates from every major agricultural region would be attending, along with representatives from tourism organizations, technology companies, and environmental groups. The choice of venue was no accident. Henderson Hay had become synonymous with successful integration of tradition and innovation in agriculture. As Maya made her final adjustments to the soil monitoring system, Jacob reflected on how much had changed in 2 decades. The farm's original hayfields now stood alongside experimental plots where new cultivation techniques were being tested. Advanced sensors monitored everything from soil moisture to microbial activity, sending data to computers that could adjust irrigation and fertilization in real time. Yet underneath all the technology, the fundamental principles his grandfather had understood still held true. The land would tell you what it needed if you knew how to listen. The parking incident had become more than just a clever solution to a local problem. It had sparked a global conversation about the preservation of agricultural land in the face of tourism pressure. Case studies had been written, documentaries had been filmed, and the Henderson method of creative problem-solving was now taught in business schools and agricultural programs alike. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people viewed the relationship between tourism and agriculture. The county had pioneered what became known as Agricultural Tourism 2.0, an approach that treated farms not as backdrops for tourist photos, but as living classrooms where visitors could learn about the complexities of food production. The morning ceremony began with the dedication of a new research facility named in honor of Jacob's father. As Jacob stood at the podium, he could see faces in the crowd that reflected the global impact of that long-ago parking incident. There were farmers from France who had used similar techniques to protect their lavender fields from tourist traffic, Australian hay producers who had adapted the irrigation system for their own unique climate challenges, and even a group from Japan who had created an entire educational program based on the Henderson approach to agricultural preservation. Maya joined him on stage, carrying their most precious family heirloom, her grandfather's notebook. Its pages had been digitized, but the original was still carefully preserved. Together they unveiled a plaque that bore his father's words. "The land speaks to those who listen, teaches those who learn, and remembers those who respect it." The ceremony was followed by demonstrations of the farm's latest innovations. Visitors toured the experimental plots where traditional hay varieties were being cultivated using advanced, sustainable techniques. They saw how the original irrigation system had evolved into a sophisticated network that could precisely control soil conditions throughout the property. Some even participated in a playful reenactment of the parking incident, though now it was done with scale models and augmented reality rather than actual cars. As the day drew to a close, Jacob and Maya walked through the eastern hayfield together, past the rows of timothy grass that had witnessed so much change. They stopped at the spot where, 20 years ago, a certain white Tesla had learned an unforgettable lesson about respecting agricultural land. The soil there was now home to some of their most productive hay, consistently winning awards for its unique nutritional profile. "You know, Dad," Maya said, checking readings on her tablet, "Grandpa's old irrigation system was really ahead of its time. He understood something that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate, that the soil itself is a living, responsive system. We just have different tools for working with it now." Jacob smiled, remembering his father's quiet wisdom. The old man had never lived to see how his irrigation system would become famous for something other than watering hay. But somehow Jacob thought he would have appreciated the irony. The solution to the parking problem had been there all along, written in the soil itself, waiting for someone to listen to what the land was trying to teach. As the setting sun painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple, father and daughter made their final rounds of the farm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new visitors eager to learn about sustainable agriculture, and perhaps even new problems requiring creative solutions. But for now, Jacob was content knowing that his father's legacy lived on not just in the hay and soil, but in the wisdom that sometimes the best solutions come from working with the land rather than against it. The parking incident that had once seemed like a simple problem with a clever solution had grown into something far more significant, a catalyst for change that had helped reshape the relationship between agriculture and tourism, between tradition and innovation, between the land and those who worked it. And somewhere, Jacob liked to think, his father was smiling, knowing that his irrigation system had taught lessons far beyond anything he could have imagined. 30 years after the famous parking incident, Henderson Hay hosted a unique celebration, the 3 Generations of Innovation Symposium. Jacob, now in his 70s with silver hair, but the same determined spirit, sat in the front row alongside his daughter Maya and his teenage grandson Richard. Named after both his great-grandfather and the family's longtime friend, Richard Chen, Melissa's son, who had taken over the family's event management business. The symposium was being held in the farm's newest addition, the International Center for Agricultural Preservation, a stunning building whose architecture paid homage to both traditional barn structures and modern, sustainable design. The center's main hall was filled with agricultural leaders, tech innovators, and farmers from every corner of the globe, all gathered to discuss how a simple irrigation solution had sparked a worldwide revolution in agricultural preservation. Young Richard, at 16, represented the 5th generation of Henderson farmers. Like many in his generation, he had grown up in a world where the integration of traditional farming wisdom and cutting-edge technology was the norm. To him, the story of luxury cars stranded in strategically irrigated soil seemed almost mythical, though the lessons it taught remained deeply relevant. The symposium opened with a holographic recreation of the original incident, a technology that Richard Chen had insisted on developing before his mother's passing 5 years earlier. The audience watched in amazement as three-dimensional images showed how a farmer's ingenuity had transformed not just a single hayfield, but an entire industry's approach to agricultural preservation. "It's strange to think," Maya remarked during her keynote speech, "that what we now call the Henderson principle of creative conservation started with something as simple as watering our own land at the right time. But my father understood something fundamental that day. Sometimes the most elegant solutions come from working with nature rather than against it." The principle she referred to had become a cornerstone of modern agricultural education. It emphasized using natural systems and existing infrastructure to protect agricultural land rather than relying on barriers or enforcement. The approach had been adapted worldwide. Rice farmers in Japan used controlled flooding to prevent tourist encroachment. Lavender fields in Provence employed strategic aromatic barriers, and cattle ranches in Australia utilized natural terrain features to guide visitor flow. Jacob, watching his daughter speak, remembered how his father's irrigation system had evolved over the decades. The original manual controls were now housed in the farm's museum, while the modern system utilized quantum sensors and AI-driven environmental monitoring. Yet the basic principle remained unchanged: understanding and working with the land's natural characteristics. Young Richard had recently discovered something fascinating in the farm's archives. His great-grandfather's original calculations for the irrigation system included notes about soil reaction to pressure and moisture that had predicted with remarkable accuracy exactly how vehicles would respond to controlled soil saturation. It wasn't just clever improvisation. It had been sound agricultural science all along. The symposium included virtual tours of agricultural preservation sites worldwide, all inspired by the Henderson incident. From Australian outback stations to Scottish Highland farms, agricultural communities had adapted the principles to their unique circumstances. Each success story added to the growing body of knowledge about creative land preservation. During the lunch break, Jacob took a walk with his grandson through the farm's historic section, where some Timothy grass stands dated back to the original planting. They stopped at what the family still called Tesla Point, the spot where that first luxury electric car had found itself slowly sinking into precisely irrigated soil 3 decades ago. "You know, Grandpa," Richard said, consulting his quantum tablet, "the soil composition here is unique. Those old cars actually changed the mineral structure in ways that improved the terroir. The hay from this section has compounds we can't replicate anywhere else in the county." Jacob smiled, remembering his father's words about how the land always had more to teach them. Even the parking incident, it seemed, had contributed to the farm's distinctive character in unexpected ways. The afternoon sessions focused on the future of agricultural preservation. Presentations showcased new technologies that built upon the Henderson principles, smart soil systems that could automatically adjust their stability based on pressure detection, biodegradable barrier crops that could be activated during peak tourist seasons, and AI-driven education programs that helped visitors understand the impact of their actions on agricultural lands. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the closing ceremony, when a group of young agricultural students from around the world presented their own innovations inspired by the parking incident. Their projects demonstrated how the next generation was taking the lessons of the past and applying them to future challenges. One student had developed a system for protecting endangered rice terraces in Asia using controlled water flow to naturally guide tourist traffic. Another had created a biodegradable ground cover that changed color when compacted, providing a visible warning system for overused agricultural areas. Each project showed how the simple wisdom of working with natural systems continued to evolve and adapt. As the symposium drew to a close, Jacob, Maya, and Richard stood together on the old porch, where the story had begun 30 years ago. The view had changed. Solar collectors now gleamed alongside the hayfields, and autonomous farming robots moved quietly between the rows. But the essential character of the land remained unchanged. "It's amazing," Maya mused, "how one incident could have such far-reaching effects. We're not just growing hay anymore, we're growing ideas." "And the best part is," young Richard added, "we're still learning new things from what happened. Every soil sample, every harvest, every new adaptation of the principle teaches us something new." Jacob nodded, thinking about how his father's irrigation system had become so much more than a solution to a parking problem. It had become a symbol of how agricultural traditions could adapt and thrive in a changing world, how working with the land could solve problems that force never could, and how one farmer's creative solution could inspire generations of innovation. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across land that had seen so much change yet remained true to its essential nature, Jacob remembered something his grandfather used to say. "The land remembers everything we do too, it good or bad, and teaches those lessons to anyone willing to listen." The parking incident had taught its lesson well, and that lesson continued to evolve and spread, like water flowing through fertile soil, nurturing new ideas and innovations with each passing generation. In the end, it had never really been about parking at all. It had been about understanding that the solution to any problem could be found in working with nature rather than against it, in respecting tradition while embracing innovation, and in recognizing that sometimes the best teaching comes not from confrontation, but from letting people experience the natural consequences of their actions. Henderson Hay had become more than a farm. It was a living testament to the power of creative problem-solving and the importance of preserving agricultural wisdom for future generations. And somewhere, Jacob liked to think, his father and grandfather were smiling, knowing that their irrigation system had not just watered hay and taught a few tourists a lesson. It had helped plant the seeds of a worldwide movement in agricultural preservation that continued to flourish in ways they could never have imagined. 40 years after the legendary parking incident, Henderson Hay Farm hosted what many considered the agricultural event of the decade. The United Nations had designated it as the site for the Global Agricultural Resilience Summit, bringing together delegates from 152 countries to address the growing challenges of food production in a changing world. The significance of the location wasn't lost on anyone. What had started as a simple farm, defending itself against thoughtless tourists, had become an international beacon for agricultural innovation and preservation. Jacob Henderson, now in his 80s, watched from his wheelchair as dignitaries from across the globe streamed onto the property that had been in his family for over a century. His grandson Richard, now 26 and holding a doctorate in regenerative agriculture, had taken the operational lead at what was now officially called the Henderson Institute for Agricultural Futures. The young man moved confidently among world leaders and farming pioneers alike, his easy manner belying the deep knowledge that had made him a respected voice in global agricultural circles before his 30th birthday. "Grandpa," Richard said, kneeling beside Jacob's wheelchair during a break between sessions, "the UN Secretary-General wants to know if you'd be willing to say a few words at the closing ceremony. They're calling you the Patriarch of Preservation." Jacob laughed, the sound still robust despite his years. "Tell her I'd be honored, but only if they stop using that ridiculous title. I'm just a hay farmer who got tired of people parking on his grass." But they both knew it was far more than that. The Henderson legacy, as agricultural scholars now called it, had transformed farming communities worldwide. What began as an irrigation-based parking deterrent had evolved into a comprehensive philosophy of working with natural systems rather than imposing artificial solutions, a philosophy that had proven increasingly vital as climate change and population growth put unprecedented pressure on global food systems. The summit's main pavilion, a breathtaking structure of sustainable timber and living plant walls, stood on the exact spot where the first luxury cars had found themselves mired in strategically moistened soil 4 decades earlier. Delegates, now gathered there to discuss irrigation innovations, soil health preservation, and the integration of traditional farming wisdom with emerging technologies. As the afternoon sun filtered through the pavilion's solar collection panels, casting dappled light across the assembled experts, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The parking incident itself now seemed almost quaint, a simple problem with a simple solution. Yet it had contained all the elements that would later define the Henderson approach: observation of natural systems, creative use of existing resources, and allowing natural consequences to teach lasting lessons. The most profound changes had come in the decades after the incident. Henderson Hay had pioneered what they called responsive agriculture, farming methods that adapted to changing conditions rather than fighting against them. Their soil management techniques had been adopted across 6 continents, helping farmers maintain productivity even as climate patterns grew increasingly unpredictable. Most importantly, the Henderson Institute had become the world's foremost center for preserving and integrating indigenous and traditional agricultural knowledge. They had documented farming practices from hundreds of cultures, creating the world's largest database of time-tested agricultural wisdom. This knowledge, combined with cutting-edge technology, had created resilient farming systems that withstood droughts, floods, and temperature extremes that would have devastated conventional operations. "Your great-grandfather would never believe what his irrigation system started," Jacob said to Richard as they watched a demonstration of soil microbiome management techniques derived from both Polynesian traditional practices and advanced molecular biology. "I think he would," Richard replied. "He understood the fundamental truth that's guided everything we've done. The land already knows what it needs. Our job is just to listen carefully enough." The summit's evening gala took place in what had once been the eastern hayfield, the site of the original parking incident. Now it featured a spectacular demonstration garden showcasing agricultural traditions from around the world. Delegates dined on foods grown using heritage methods from 6 continents, all adapted to Colorado's unique climate using Henderson techniques. As the evening progressed, the UN Secretary-General took the stage, her presence underscoring the global significance of what had begun as a local farming dispute. 40 years ago, she began, a farmer faced a problem we now recognize as universal: the tension between modern convenience and agricultural preservation. The solution he found that day laid the groundwork for what we now recognize as one of the most significant agricultural philosophies of the 21st century. She gestured to where Jacob sat with his family. The Henderson legacy teaches us that our most powerful innovations often come not from imposing our will upon the land, but from understanding and working with natural systems. This principle has helped farming communities from Mali to Mongolia, from Peru to the Philippines, adapt to challenges that once seemed insurmountable. The crowd rose in a standing ovation as Jacob was wheeled to the podium. He waved away the formality with a farmer's practicality, waiting for the applause to subside before speaking. "I'm grateful for your kind words," he began, his voice still, clear and strong, but the truth is simpler than all that. I didn't create a philosophy or start a movement. I just watered my hay at the right time and in the right way. A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the audience. "The real insight didn't come from me," Jacob continued. "It came from my father and grandfather, who taught me that the land speaks its own language. They showed me that a good farmer isn't someone who conquers the soil, but someone who becomes fluent in what the earth is trying to tell us." He paused, looking out over the assembled experts and dignitaries. The parking incident that somehow made our farm famous wasn't really about cars or tourism or even agriculture. It was about respect. Respect for the land. Respect for the knowledge passed down through generations. Respect for natural processes that we ignore at our peril. As Jacob spoke, images projected behind him showed the evolution of Henderson hay through the decades. From the original family farm to the global research institute it had become. The final image showed a simple irrigation valve, the kind that had been used in the original parking incident. This humble piece of equipment changed our lives, because we used it to work with nature rather than against it. And that's the real lesson that I hope outlives me. Our greatest innovations won't come from dominating the natural world, but from becoming better students of its wisdom. When Jacob finished speaking, the silence was profound. Then, slowly, the applause began, building to a thunderous ovation that seemed to roll across the farm like summer rain. Later that evening, as most delegates returned to their hotels in nearby towns, a small group gathered on the Henderson farmhouse porch. Jacob, Richard, Maya, and a handful of the world's most influential agricultural thinkers. The conversation flowed as easily as the local whiskey they shared, jumping from soil microbiology to indigenous irrigation techniques, from climate adaptation to the future of food security. As midnight approached, the discussion turned to what many considered the most remarkable aspect of the Henderson legacy, its unplanned nature. No one could have predicted that a simple act of agricultural self-defense would launch a global movement that preserved farming traditions while advancing agricultural science. That's always been the beauty of it, said Professor Lin Chen from Beijing Agricultural University, a descendant of Melissa Chen, whose family had maintained ties with the Hendersons across generations. The solution wasn't imposed from above, it emerged organically from a specific place and problem. That's why it's been so adaptable to different contexts worldwide. Jacob nodded, taking a slow sip of his whiskey as he gazed out over fields, now silvered by moonlight. My father used to say that the best ideas are like seeds. They contain everything they need to grow if you plant them in the right soil. We just planted a simple idea. Work with the land, not against it. And it found fertile ground in people who were ready to think differently about agriculture. Richard, who had been quiet for much of the evening, leaned forward. What's remarkable to me is how something so local became so universal. Farmers in completely different environments with entirely different crops found something useful in a technique designed for Colorado hayfields. That's because it wasn't really about hay or irrigation, Maya interjected. It was about relationship. How we relate to the land, how we relate to traditional knowledge, how we relate to each other. Good relationships work in any context. The conversation continued late into the night, touching on the challenges still facing global agriculture and the innovations emerging from unexpected places. Throughout it all, the gentle presence of the land itself seemed to ground their discussions. The same soil that had taught a memorable lesson to careless tourists 4 decades earlier, now silently supporting this gathering of those who had learned to listen to what it had to say. The following morning, as the summit entered its final day, Jacob insisted on visiting a special corner of the farm rarely shown to visitors. With Richard pushing his wheelchair along a winding path, they came to a small, unassuming plot, surrounded by native wildflowers. This, Jacob explained to the small group of delegates who had been invited to join them, is where it all began. Not with the parking incident, but generations before. This is where my great-grandfather planted the first hay crop when he homesteaded this land. We've maintained it exactly as it was, using only the methods he brought with him from the old country. The plot looked strikingly different from the high-tech fields that dominated the rest of the farm. No sensors monitored soil conditions here, no advanced irrigation systems regulated water flow, just carefully tended hay, grown using techniques that would have been recognized by farmers from centuries past. We keep this plot as a reminder, Jacob continued. No matter how far our research takes us, no matter how sophisticated our technology becomes, everything we do is built on the foundation laid by farmers who understood the land through direct experience and careful observation. One of the delegates, an agronomist from Kenya, knelt to examine the soil. "This is remarkable," she said. "The soil structure here is perfect. You can feel the health in it." Jacob nodded. 7 generations of consistent care will do that. My father called this our wisdom plot, the place where we come when we need to remember the fundamentals. When I was trying to figure out how to solve our parking problem all those years ago, I came here to think. Something about seeing. This continuity cleared my mind and helped me see the solution that was already there. As the small group made their way back to the main summit facilities, they passed the Institute's most advanced research field, a testing ground for agricultural technologies so cutting-edge that many weren't yet public knowledge. The contrast with the wisdom plot they had just visited was striking. "Some people see these as opposites," Richard explained, noticing the delegates' reaction. "Traditional versus modern, past versus future. But we've always seen them as complementary. Our most advanced innovations work because they're grounded in time-tested principles. The summit's closing ceremonies took place that afternoon beneath Colorado's vast blue sky. As delegates prepared to return to their home countries, carrying with them new knowledge, new connections, and new possibilities, the Secretary-General made a final announcement. Today, the United Nations is proud to launch the Henderson Initiative. She declared, this global program will establish regional agricultural resilience centers modeled after this institute, adapted to local conditions and traditions in every major agricultural region worldwide. These centers will preserve traditional farming knowledge while developing innovations that work with natural systems rather than against them. She paused, looking directly at Jacob. The first funding for this initiative comes from an unusual source, a consortium of luxury automobile manufacturers. A wave of appreciative laughter swept through the crowd as she continued. They tell me they're still trying to make amends for some poorly parked cars from 4 decades ago. As the ceremony concluded and delegates began their journeys home, Jacob found himself alone with Richard on the old farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. 4 decades had passed since that fateful day when he had used his father's irrigation system to teach some festival-goers a lesson about respecting farmland. Now that simple act had rippled outward to touch agricultural practices around the world. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they hadn't parked on our hay that day? Richard asked. Jacob smiled. I've thought about that often. We might have developed many of the same techniques eventually. We might have found other ways to preserve what mattered. But I doubt we would have learned the most important lesson quite so clearly. Which is that the most powerful changes don't come from fighting against problems. They come from understanding systems so deeply that you can work within them to create natural consequences that teach lasting lessons. Richard nodded, understanding that his grandfather was talking about something far beyond parking or irrigation, or even agriculture. He was describing a way of moving through the world, observing carefully, respecting natural processes, and finding solutions that worked with inherent patterns rather than imposing artificial ones. As twilight deepened over Henderson Hay, father and grandson sat in companionable silence, watching the first stars appear above fields that had witnessed a remarkable journey. From a simple act of agricultural self-defense to a global movement that was helping to secure humanity's food future, the land itself seemed to breathe around them, alive with the wisdom of 7 generations of careful stewardship. Somewhere beneath their feet, the soil still held memories of luxury cars stranded in strategically moistened earth. A small moment that had sparked a transformation far beyond anything Jacob could have imagined on that long-ago festival weekend. In the distance, the lights of the research facilities glowed softly, where scientists from around the world were developing the next generation of agricultural innovations, all founded on the principle that had started with an irritated farmer and his irrigation system. Listen to what the land is telling you, and solutions will reveal themselves. You know, Jacob said finally, I've received a lot of honors and recognition over the years, but none of them captured what really happened. They call me an innovator, a pioneer, even a visionary. Aren't you? Richard asked. Jacob shook his head. I'm just someone who paid attention. The real innovation came from the land itself. It already knew how to solve the problem. I just had to be quiet enough to hear what it was telling me. As night fell completely over Henderson Hay, the stars reflected in the small irrigation ponds that dotted the property. The same water that had once taught a memorable lesson about respecting farmland now nourished crops that fed communities near and far. The same soil that had swallowed luxury car tires now supported agricultural research that was helping farmers adapt to a changing climate. And the same family that had once just wanted people to stay off their hay was now at the center of a global movement to preserve agricultural wisdom while advancing its frontiers. It had all begun with a simple lesson, taught not through confrontation, but through allowing natural consequences to speak for themselves. A lesson about respect, relationship, and the wisdom inherent in working with natural systems rather than against them. As Jacob and Richard made their way back to the farmhouse, lights glowing warm against the night, they passed a small sign at the edge of the property, one of the few reminders of where their journey had begun. It read simply, "Henderson Hay, where parking problems become agricultural solutions." It was, Jacob thought, a fitting epitaph for a story that had begun with cars stuck in mud and grown into something that was helping to secure humanity's relationship with the land that sustained it. A reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest actions, and that wisdom often comes from unexpected places, including an irrigation valve turned at just the right moment by a farmer who was tired of people parking on his hay. 50 years had passed since the legendary parking incident that transformed Henderson Hay from a family farm into a global agricultural phenomenon. The world had changed dramatically in those 5 decades. Climate patterns had shifted, population centers had moved, and technology had advanced in ways that would have seemed like science fiction during that fateful festival weekend. Yet through it all, the Henderson principles had endured, spreading from their Colorado origins to influence farming practices on every inhabited continent. What began as a simple irrigation solution to a parking problem had evolved into one of the most influential agricultural philosophies of the 21st century. Now, on the golden anniversary of what historians called the irrigation incident, something unprecedented was happening at the Henderson Institute. 1,000 farmers from around the world had made pilgrimages to the birthplace of the agricultural movement that had transformed their lives and livelihoods. They came not as tourists or students, but as practitioners bringing their own innovations to share in a global exchange of agricultural wisdom. The event, officially called the Henderson Semi-Centennial Agricultural Convergence, had a more popular name among attendees: the parking lot. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all on Richard Henderson, now in his 60s with silver streaking his hair, who had become the primary steward of his family's legacy after his grandfather, Jacob's passing 5 years earlier. "My grandfather would have loved this," Richard remarked to his daughter Ellie, the 6th generation of Hendersons to work this land, as they watched farmers from Mali demonstrate water conservation techniques they had developed by combining Henderson principles with traditional Dogon practices. He always said the best ideas would come when farmers from different traditions started learning from each other. Ellie, at 32, had already established herself as a formidable agricultural innovator. Her work on mycorrhizal networks, the fungal connections that allowed plants to communicate and share resources underground, had opened new frontiers in crop resilience. Yet, She carried her expertise with the same unpretentious practicality that had characterized Henderson's for generations. "What amazes me," she said, watching the demonstration, "is how everyone here has taken the same basic principle, working with natural systems rather than against them, and applied it in completely different ways, depending on their local conditions. It's like the same seed producing different plants in different soils." Around them, the Institute grounds had been transformed into a living exhibition of global agricultural adaptation. Japanese rice farmers demonstrated water management techniques that had evolved from studying the original Henderson irrigation system. Indigenous agriculturalists from the Amazon shared methods for increasing soil fertility using biochar created with modified Henderson principles. Australian ranchers explained how they had adapted the soil moisture manipulation approach to create natural animal movement patterns that prevented overgrazing. Each innovation bore the unmistakable Henderson imprint, a deep respect for natural processes, creative use of existing resources, and an understanding that the most effective solutions often came from careful observation rather than imposed technology. Yet each also reflected the unique cultural and ecological context from which it had emerged. The convergence extended beyond the Institute's traditional boundaries. Local residents, many of whom had grown up with the parking incident as part of their community's folklore, had opened their homes to visiting farmers. The Hayfield Festival, still going strong after half a century, had redesigned its entire program to celebrate agricultural traditions from around the world. What had once been a tension between tourism and farming had evolved into a symbiotic relationship that strengthened both. As afternoon sunlight slanted across the demonstration fields, Richard found himself standing at the exact spot where his grandfather had adjusted the irrigation valves 50 years earlier, setting in motion events that would eventually touch lives around the world. Next to him stood Ibrahim al-Hashimi, a desert agriculture specialist, whose grandfather had been one of the first international students to study at Henderson after the incident gained global attention. "My grandfather told me stories about your grandfather," Ibrahim said, gazing across fields where cutting-edge agricultural experiments now grew alongside heritage crop varieties. He said Jacob Henderson was the first person who helped him understand that the desert wasn't an adversary to be conquered, but a teacher whose lessons could feed nations if we learned to listen. Richard nodded, remembering how his grandfather had always insisted that the land itself was the greatest teacher. Jacob would say the parking incident wasn't really his innovation at all. He was just paying attention to what the soil already knew. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Amara Sen, Director General of the United Nations Global Food Security Alliance, who had come to make a historic announcement. As the assembled farmers gathered around the main pavilion, anticipation rippled through the crowd. 50 years ago, Dr. Sen began, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet fields, a single act of agricultural creativity on this farm began a transformation that has helped humanity weather some of its greatest food security challenges. Today, I am honored to announce that the Henderson Principles have been officially incorporated into the UN Sustainable Development Framework as a foundational approach to global agricultural resilience. The crowd erupted in applause, but Dr. Sen wasn't finished. More significantly, the Henderson Institution for Indigenous and Traditional Agricultural Knowledge has been established, with centers on 6 continents dedicated to preserving and advancing the agricultural wisdom of cultures worldwide. As she continued outlining the initiative, Richard felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Eduardo Vasquez, a Mexican sustainable agriculture pioneer whose family had been practicing chinampas farming, a sophisticated form of raised bed agriculture, for generations before discovering how perfectly it aligned with Henderson approaches. "Your family did something remarkable," Eduardo said quietly. "You didn't just create new agricultural techniques. You helped the world remember the value of old ones." Before Henderson, traditional farming knowledge was disappearing everywhere. Now it's recognized as essential to humanity's future. As evening approached, the formal presentations gave way to a massive communal meal prepared by farmers from dozens of countries, each dish representing agricultural traditions that had been preserved and enhanced through application of Henderson principles. Under canopies set up in what had once been the impromptu festival parking area, farmers who couldn't speak each other's languages nevertheless communicated through their shared understanding of soil, water, and growing things. Richard found himself seated between a Norwegian seed preservation specialist and a Vietnamese rice terrace engineer, discussing how traditional knowledge could be adapted to address emerging climate challenges. The conversation flowed as naturally as water finding its path downhill, crossing boundaries of language, culture, and geography through their shared connection to the land. "The most revolutionary thing your grandfather did," the Norwegian woman observed, "was to demonstrate that working with natural systems wasn't primitive or backward. It was actually the most advanced approach possible. He gave scientific legitimacy to what indigenous farmers had always known." As the celebration continued into the night, with music and dance from agricultural traditions worldwide, Richard slipped away for a quiet moment. He made his way to the small family cemetery, where Jacob and the earlier generations of Hendersons rested beneath the Colorado stars. At his grandfather's simple headstone, he placed a small jar containing soil samples sent by farmers from 50 countries, a tribute to how far the Henderson legacy had spread. "You would never believe what grew from your irrigation valve, Grandpa," he said softly to the night air. "Or maybe you would. You always did see further than the rest of us." The next morning, as dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, Richard joined Ellie and a small group of the world's most innovative farmers for a private demonstration of the Institute's most advanced project, a comprehensive approach to agricultural resilience that integrated modern technology with traditional wisdom at unprecedented scales. The Living Landscape Initiative, as they called it, represented the culmination of 50 years of Henderson principles. Using a sophisticated network of sensors, satellite data, and artificial intelligence, it created a dynamic map of how water, nutrients, and energy moved through agricultural ecosystems. But unlike previous attempts at precision agriculture, this system didn't try to impose human control. Instead, it helped farmers better understand and work with natural patterns. "The core innovation," Ellie explained to the assembled experts, "is that we're not using technology to override natural systems, but to help us better perceive and participate in them. The AI doesn't tell farmers what to do. It helps translate what the land is already saying." As the visitors studied the living maps displaying everything from soil microbiome activity to mycorrhizal network communication between plant species, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the journey from that first irrigation intervention to this sophisticated integration of ancient wisdom and cutting-edge technology. My grandfather used to say that every farm tells a story if you know how to read it, he told the group. What we're doing now is simply creating better translation tools so the land's story can be understood more clearly. One of the visitors, a regenerative agriculture pioneer from Kenya, nodded thoughtfully. The beauty of the Henderson approach has always been that it doesn't impose a narrative on the land. It helps us become better listeners to the story the land is already telling. As the demonstration concluded, the conversation turned to the future of agriculture in a world facing unprecedented challenges: climate instability, soil degradation, water scarcity. The list of threats to global food security seemed overwhelming. Yet among this group of farmers who had embraced the Henderson principles, there was a remarkable absence of despair. "What gives me hope," said a permaculture designer from New Zealand, "is that we're finally asking the right questions. Instead of asking how we can force the land to produce more, we're asking how we can better align with natural systems that have sustained life for millennia." Richard nodded. "That's the real legacy of the parking incident, not any particular technique, but a fundamental shift in how we approach problems. My grandfather didn't try to build barriers or call authorities when people parked on his hay. He asked himself, how can I work with what's already here to create a natural consequence that teaches a lasting lesson?" As the final day of the semi-centennial convergence began, farmers from around the world gathered once more on the historic Eastern hayfield. In a ceremony that bridged cultures and agricultural traditions, each participant brought a small amount of soil from their homeland to contribute to a commemorative garden designed to symbolize the global reach of the Henderson principles. As Richard watched farmers from 6 continents add their soil to the garden, he was struck by how far beyond agriculture the Henderson influence had spread. The same principles that had transformed farming, working with natural systems, allowing consequences to teach lasting lessons, finding solutions in careful observation rather than imposed control, had influenced fields from urban planning to conflict resolution, from education to environmental restoration. The garden's centerpiece was a sophisticated irrigation system that mirrored the one Jacob had used 50 years earlier, updated with modern materials but functioning on exactly the same principles. Water flowed through it not on a timed schedule, but in response to actual soil conditions, demonstrating the responsive approach to resource management that had become the Henderson hallmark. As the ceremony concluded, Richard stood before the assembled farmers, feeling the weight of 50 years of history and the presence of generations of Hendersons who had tended this land before him. "My grandfather often said that he didn't create anything new," Richard began. "He insisted that he simply noticed what was already there, the way water moved through soil, the way natural consequences could teach lasting lessons, the way solutions emerge when you work with systems rather than against them." He gestured to the surrounding fields, where heritage crops grew alongside experimental varieties, where traditional hand tools were displayed next to advanced agricultural robots, where farmers from vastly different traditions found common ground in their relationship with the land. What we celebrate today isn't just an agricultural approach, it's a way of being in the world. The parking incident may have begun with my grandfather's frustration, but it ended with a profound insight that wisdom often comes not from imposing our will, but from aligning ourselves with processes already in motion. As Richard concluded his remarks, a gentle rain began to fall, a fitting tribute, he thought, to a legacy that had begun with a farmer's creative use of water. The assembled agriculturalists didn't scatter for shelter, but stood with faces upturned, each experiencing the rain through the lens of their own farming tradition, yet united by their shared understanding of water as the lifeblood of agriculture. Later, as the convergence participants prepared to return to their respective corners of the world, Richard found himself walking the farm's boundaries with his daughter. Ellie had recently announced her intention to establish Henderson satellite research centers in regions facing the most severe agricultural challenges: desert environments, flood-prone coastlines, areas with degraded soils. What would great-grandpa Jacob think of how far his irrigation trick has spread? She asked, as they crested a small hill overlooking the entire property. Richard considered the question carefully. I think he'd be amused by the attention, but proud of the principles. He never sought to create a movement or establish a legacy. He just wanted to be a good steward of this land and help others do the same with theirs. As the sun began to set on the 50th anniversary of the parking incident, casting long shadows across fields that had witnessed a remarkable journey from local ingenuity to global influence, Richard reflected on the true meaning of the Henderson legacy. It wasn't found in the advanced research facilities or international recognition, but in something much simpler, a way of relating to the land that recognized its inherent wisdom and worked in partnership with natural systems, rather than attempting to dominate them. The parking incident that had started it all now seemed almost quaint in its simplicity, yet it contained the seed of everything that followed, the recognition that the most powerful solutions often come not from fighting against problems, but from understanding systems so deeply that creative interventions emerge naturally, like water finding its path downhill. As darkness fell over Henderson Hay, lights from the farewell celebration glowed warmly against the night sky. Farmers from around the world shared a final meal together, exchanging seeds, knowledge, and promises of continued collaboration. The next morning they would disperse to their respective homelands, carrying with them not just new techniques, but a renewed appreciation for agriculture as a bridge between human creativity and natural wisdom. In the quiet moments before joining the celebration, Richard and Ellie paused at the farm's original irrigation control station, now preserved as a historic landmark. The simple valve that Jacob had adjusted to create precisely moistened soil beneath unauthorized vehicles had been the unlikely beginning of a global agricultural renaissance that continued to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The most powerful legacies, Richard said, tracing the weathered metal with his fingertips, are the ones that grow beyond their creators' imaginations. Great-grandpa just wanted people to stop parking on his hay. He could never have envisioned how that simple act would ripple outward to touch lives around the world. Ellie nodded, her eyes reflecting the determination that had characterized Henderson's for generations. But the core insight remains the same. Listen to what the land is telling you, work with natural systems rather than against them, and allow consequences to teach lasting lessons. Together, they turned toward the lights of the celebration, where farmers from around the world were sharing the fruits of half a century of agricultural innovation sparked by one farmer's creative solution to a parking problem. The Henderson legacy lived on, not as a static monument, but as a dynamic, evolving approach to agriculture that continued to adapt to new challenges while remaining true to its foundational insight: that the land itself contains the wisdom we need if only we learn to listen. And somewhere, Richard liked to think, his grandfather was smiling at how his simple irrigation adjustment had grown into a global movement that was helping humanity rediscover its relationship with the soil that sustained it, a movement that had begun with cars stuck in mud, but had evolved into something that was helping secure food futures worldwide, all because one resourceful farmer had decided to let the land itself teach a lesson about respect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.